Hey, I'm Summer.
And I'm Mike.
And we got married.
With children.
We're married 2 years now.
Blended for 11.
Like a margarita.
Yeah, baby, like a margarita.
And you're listening to the Everything Always podcast.
Want to tell them why we do this?
We do this because blending families isn't easy. There's step-parenting, co-parenting, his ex,
Her ex.
schedules, sibling rivalry,
Money issues.
custody issues.
Dating and relationship issues.
It's a whole lot of stuff.
Blended with a whole lot of good stuff.
And we're here to talk about all of it because we've done most of it.
We might not be experts, but we've learned a lot.
And we're still learning, and we want to share that with you.
Thanks for joining. Now let's go.
Welcome to another episode. Today I am interviewing Christina McGhee, who is an internationally recognized divorce parenting expert, speaker, coach, and she's the author of the highly acclaimed book, Parenting Apart: How Separated and Divorced Parents Can Raise Happy and Secure Kids. She's incredible. I actually sought her out myself for needs that I had and advice that I needed to get for our family and certain things that we were dealing with. And she has just been this incredible person and has become a friend and a guide for me. And I was like, I have to have her on the show. So of course, she's on the show today, and I'm just thrilled. And she's somebody that I would love to keep bringing back. She has so much empathy. She's so wise, and her advice is just golden. And so what I did with today's episode was I took the most common questions that we get, and then what I did was put them into categories, and then I took, okay, what's a really compelling question out of those categories, and let's see if we can hit all of these. So some of the most frequently asked questions that people will write in about in terms of blending their families, I think you'll get those questions answered. And she's just awesome. So I'm so excited to have her on the show, and I think you're really going to love this one. Christina, I am so excited that you're here. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to talk about so many good things. I have questions lined up for you, some of them that I talked about in the intro. We have an actual divorce parenting expert here on the show, and I'm just so thrilled that you're with me today.
Summer, I'm delighted to be here.
So before we dive into all the juicy questions, I'd love for you to share your background, how you came into this career and why it's so important to you.
Yeah. So for me, it was one of those situations where my personal and professional life just kind of collided, and I thought I was going left and I ended up going right. So my background is in clinical social work. And, when I married the love of my life, he came with 2 kids and an ex-wife.
Yeah.
And so I jumped right into being a bonus mom. And I come from a divorced family myself. So My parents' divorce was not, I wouldn't put it in the super high conflict category, but it also wasn't a walk in the park either. I mean, there was a lot of underlying tension that I grew up with as a kid. And so when I became a bonus mom, I was pretty clear about what I didn't want my bonus kids to have to deal with, and that I was really committed to wanting to do the very best I could to make this a good situation for them, to be supportive of them in having 2 households.
Right.
So I started, like any kind of card-carrying social worker, I just started researching. And a lot of the information I found wasn't really practical, wasn't really helpful. It didn't really fit my situation. It was like people were really good at identifying the problem, but there weren't, solutions. So I started doing some research. And then in the process of all that, my husband, we went back to court. We didn't have a great relationship with the kid's mom at the time. And so he had to go back to court and got required to take a parenting course, which is pretty common in our jurisdiction. When you file for divorce, you have to take a 4-hour parenting class. And
that's so interesting. I remember us talking about that. Yeah, we don't have that here in California, at least.
Well, I found that, it depends on where you are, because it's been around in the United States, these kind of courses, for like 40 years, but they're still kind of hit or miss. And now many of them have moved into kind of an online forum. But back in the day, you had to show up and listen to an instructor and take this 4-hour co-parenting course. My husband came home from this course and he handed me a business card and he said, here, this is from one of the instructors of the course. You should be teaching this.
Wow.
And I went, what? What? And so I interviewed with the organization that taught the courses and I got really interested, and that's where I started. And I taught those courses for like 12 years and loved it. I loved being in the room with parents, which kind of spiraled me into where I am today. It just has been kind of a very amazing adventure. I launched a website. I wrote a book. I've done some media work, just kind of all of these experiences that were so not on my radar popped up and continue to pop up. So I feel very blessed. And I have a lot of compassion for parents that are going through this. This is just so, so hard on so many levels. And so many parents deal with this experience in isolation, even though it's quite common. And so anything that I can do to be supportive, I think is valuable, when people can connect.
It's so true. And there's so many things that Mike and I will say this a lot. There's so many things that pop up just in a regular, parents are still married in just family in general. But then when you start to mix different families, you have an ex-partner, and then they might have another spouse, and then that causes something. And then there's different in-laws. There's so many things that pop up. And it is, like you said, even still, when I hear conversations, it's really talking about the problem, and all these different problems, and people struggle to offer solutions to each other. So it's so great that you're doing this.
It is, parenting period is tough, right? And complicated. And it takes a lot of dedication and commitment. And then, and that's with someone you're choosing to have a family with. Well, when you choose not to be partners anymore, that puts a whole new twist on things. So in addition to having to make these really hard decisions sometimes as parents, you got to deal with the fact that you may not have the same level of commitment and relationship and connection anymore. And there's all those dynamics that are kind of under the surface of this parenting thing you're doing. So, it's tough. And a lot of us think, well, we feel very alone, and it helps to be connected to other people and find out you're not. There are
Right.
Lots of other parents who are struggling with the same issues, the same questions.
Yes, definitely. What's interesting is, and I'm going to go into these questions soon, but what I found really interesting is that a lot of the questions that we get are in the earlier part of the blending or the relationship, when it comes to being a bonus mom, or introducing a partner to your kids, or blending, the kids starting to become, this is your new brother. Those type of situations I'm finding it at the earlier parts of relationships rather than later. And yet they still happen. I know my cousin, for example, we were talking about this over the weekend. She's been married to her husband for 26 years. His kids are grown. They also have a child together. And there's still sometimes issues with the ex-wife and the whole entire family. But the difference is how it's handled now. Do you think that this is just something that comes with time? Why do you think it is like so much in the kids when they're younger as opposed to?
Well, I don't know that I completely agree with that, only because I think what happens in lots of situations, because I've talked to lots of grown children of divorce.
Yeah.
And what happens is I think parents fall into the trap of thinking that once kids get older, they can just kind of handle it, that we don't need to be as sensitive. We don't need to pay attention because they're older now. But, there's graduations, there's weddings, there's grandchildren, there's other big life events where a lot of times adult children really get caught in the middle. Who do they spend the holidays with? Now there's not an order or a structure kind of dictating that. And so they feel pulled in a lot of different directions. And you may even have a situation where they start a family on their own and they've got, two sets of parents and their spouse has two sets of parents. So now you've got four sets of, people expecting you to show up for Christmas Eve or Thanksgiving or Easter, so it can become complicated. So I think that's a piece of it. I think the other piece of it is, as kids get older and time passes and the dust settles, those emotions that we really feel so strongly in the early stages tend to die down. And so that intensity is cut back in some situations, not all, but in some. And so I think that makes it easier. People move on with their lives and they get to a place of acceptance, and we're not, going through that kind of grieving process that we do in the early stages. And the thing is that in the early stages, there are so many changes that are happening. When you're blending a family, I think people forget that there are losses to grieve, even when it's a good change. Kids are having to accept the reality that this is permanent, a new way of living. So change is change. It's hard. It's hard even when it's good. And I think we tend to forget that. So I think that may be part of the equation as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think what really stands out for me too, as you're saying this, is not to forget that, like you said, as an adult, I see it in our children as they get older. And it's always important to us to be like, hey, don't feel guilty if you want to be here with your mom this time and then us, or however it is. Don't feel guilty about that. But you can see that there is that as they become, they're teenagers, right? And they're approaching adulthood. I do kind of see that. And I think it is important. Like, I love that you said that. It is important to recognize that there is still that struggle, even though they're not so much in this grieving process. There is still that awkwardness or that, obligation or whatever. And it is hard to be torn. And I think, unfortunately, for some teens and even young adults and adults, I think they are presented with guilt. They are saying, what, oh, you're not going to come over to our house for Christmas? And I've seen that happen. And I'm like, ouch, don't do that. Way to push away.
But, a lot of parents simply don't think about it. They think that because their kids are adults and, intellectually, they understand the workings and the complications of relationships, and they have a voice, they can make their own decisions. They'll just tell us. Well, no, a lot of times they won't, because kids, even as adults, feel a real strong pull to keep things fair, to not rock the boat, to, be even-handed with parents, and a lot of times feel more caught in the middle. So I think it's important for parents to realize this is kind of a lifetime gig. Your kids don't stop needing you once they turn 18. You're still always going to be mom and dad. And anything you can do to kind of minimize the stress that they have to deal with, is going to be appreciated by them. They're going to recognize it, and they're going to feel a sense of relief, So family life changes. And as parents, we kind of have to adapt our parenting to those changes, whether we're married, single, or divorced.
Exactly. Yes. Well, let me get into some of these questions. And I think that anyone going through the process of divorce, blending a family, I think you'll find something valuable from the answers of all of these questions. So I'll start with this first one. And this is something, I'm glad that I have this question, because this is actually something very common that we've seen amongst friends that have gone through divorce, and also people that write in. This is a very common one. So it is, I know my ex-wife is speaking poorly to the kids when they are with her. She keeps telling the kids that it was my fault we got divorced. How do I respond to them and the negative things she is telling them about me?
Ooh, yeah, that is a very common situation that lots of parents struggle with. And I spend a lot of time talking with parents. While it's really tempting to want to give your side of the story to kind of set the record straight, it is almost never helpful to children to do that. because what happens is that kids kind of get sucked into this no-win situation where they're bouncing back and forth between parents trying to figure out the truth, and they get drawn deeper into adult issues and problems. So while you think explaining your perspective is going to help them, for most kids, it increases their level of anxiety. Consider that in order to embrace your truth, they have to reject the other parent's truth.
Yes.
Yeah. So when kids come to you with these things that they're hearing from the other parent, what they're really letting you know is that they need some help processing them.
Yes.
They need
Yes.
some help putting them in context. And so that's really where the focus needs to be. How can you help them process what they've heard and how it feels for them? So one of the ways you would do that is you might say something like, wow, that must have been really confusing for you to hear mom say that. What do you think about what she said?
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about what you heard? The other piece of that is that processing doesn't mean that you have to agree with what the other parent said or keep quiet, because that's the other mistake parents make. They think, well, I'm going to take the higher ground on this one and I'm not going to say anything. Well, that's not necessarily helpful either. So what kids need to hear is, for you to put it in context. Like, it sounds like mom's really angry with me. Sometimes when parents split up, they may handle their feelings by blaming the other parent for problems in the marriage, or they may even say mean things about the other parent. I don't agree with what mom said. That's not the way I see it. I'm really sorry you had to hear that.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So really what you're doing is you're identifying, because, for kids, you want them to be able to disengage from adult issues and adult feelings and realize that it's okay to talk about them. So it's important to, let kids know it's always okay to ask questions. It's okay to talk about these things. Also realize, though, and this is a really important point, depending on your children's ages, there may be some times when you say they want to know why. Why are you having problems, or what's the fight about, or why is mama angry at you? You may need to set some boundaries and help them understand that, the problems between your mom and I are problems between us. They have nothing to do with you. And I'll always try to answer your questions, but there may be parts of our situation that I choose not to talk with you about, because I don't ever want to say anything that's going to change your relationship with the other parent. And I don't want you to be caught in the middle. These problems have nothing to do with you. And so I think that it's important to set some limits with kids and to understand when you do, well, that may not satisfy their need to know. Kids are curious and they may pressure you and like, well, why won't you tell me? Well, mom's told me. Why can't you talk about these kind of things? So just because they press you and they need to know, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to satisfy that. Kids need to know that there's limits and that you don't want them to be caught in the middle, and you don't want to say negative things about the other parent, but you can definitely assert, where there's a disagreement, identify what the emotion is. Be sure that you stay focused on the problem and not the person.
I love that so much. All of that is just it's so brilliant. What I love too is that it really models such a level of emotional maturity in how you're handling a situation. Because if you think about it the other way, if you are just trying to get, I got to tell my story, no, she's wrong and she's this, and name calling and all that kind of stuff. What are you modeling for your children and how to handle conflict in situations like that later on in their life?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is another very common one, different ages though, but this was a great question. I had to include it. My ex-husband and I have a 14-year-old daughter, and we disagree on privileges. He thinks she is old enough to date, and I don't. He allows much more freedom than I do, and I feel like it is causing confusion for her.
Yeah. Well, parenting teens isn't easy to begin with, and
right.
When you're parenting them out of two homes, it's just so much more challenging. So I would say the first thing to say to this mom is don't compromise your values. And sometimes we feel like we're kind of backed into a corner where our kids are going to be angry with us, or they're going to want to go, spend more time with the other parent because we won't let them do as much. But I think it's really important not to compromise your values and be clear on those and confident about them. Talk about the differences and acknowledge for your daughter, just like we talked about with the bad mouthing, how confusing it must be to have two parents that have very different ways of parenting. So when she's with you, be real clear and consistent with what your expectations are, what your guidelines are, and help her understand the why behind them. Part of the reason I'm making this choice is because, and then validate her feelings. I'm sure it really sucks to have, one parent that has different rules than the other one. It's got to be really hard to go back and forth. But Dad and I see this very differently. And then I think the other piece of it is, remember that one of the best ways to manage expectations with our kids is to make sure that we're putting just as much energy into connecting as we are into correcting.
Oh, yes.
So you want to stay focused on meeting her where she's at and giving her opportunities to earn trust and to work towards age-appropriate privileges, not just laying down a line and saying, until you turn 16, this isn't happening. Because what happens when she gets to 16? Is she going to be ready to take that step? Right. Is she going to know, is she going to learn what you want her to learn in terms of being able to go out on a date and what she should expect? So you want to kind of work kids in that direction. And so the other piece is that while our kids, act like they don't want structure, often looking back as adults, kids will tell you that they valued the parents who provided it versus the parents that just gave them everything they wanted. Because really, that's the easy option, right? We're not going to have a fight about this. Go ahead, do whatever you want. The parent that really was willing to stick it out, to hold the line, that actually is very helpful to kids. Their job is to push back. Our job is to stand firm. And then to make sure we have that other part, which is the validation and understanding the why and continuing the conversation and giving them opportunities to grow and to become independent. So that's what I would suggest.
I love that. I love that so much. And I think, a really valuable thing, and we've told this to our kids, sometimes things are different at one house than it is the other. And it's kind of, look at it as a gift. You get to see things done both ways. And as you become an adult, one day a parent, maybe you can decide what worked really well for you. But know that, both things are done out of love. They're different, but it's just two different opinions.
Right.
of how to do it.
And I think it's important for parents to realize, because it's not just things about, there's all kinds of differences between household and discipline differences is usually a huge, huge topic, but differences aren't a deal breaker. You can still have a good co-parenting relationship. Different is just different. Kids can manage those differences if, one, parents are managing them well and not trying to control each other. And the second one is, I tell parents, think about how your kids manage school. Does every teacher run every classroom the same exact way? Of course not. Mrs. Jackson has different rules than Mr. Alvarez. And, kids can manage going between classrooms because teachers are real clear about what the expectations are in their classroom. And chances are you're not going to find Mrs. Jackson throwing some shade at Mr. Alvarez because he has a different way of doing things. So I think that don't put your energy into trying to manage each other over these smaller differences. Focus on the bigger ticket items. Like start with overarching values. So if you think of a school has a certain expectation. They create a certain atmosphere for kids, a certain environment. So how can the two of you work together to create that? We both want, our children to feel loved and safe and protected and to have a good education and respect. Those are the big ticket items. Now, how will we each individually support those values?
Love it, love it, love it. It's funny, as you're saying this, I'm remembering one of our daughters, probably about 2 years after she'd had a teacher who was very, very firm on expectations in the classroom, probably more, quote unquote, strict compared to other teachers that she'd had. And during that year, she was just, it was such a pain to her, and she would complain. about 2 years later, she said, when I look back, she was such a great teacher. I learned so much. It was so interesting and I'm thinking about that as you're saying, when kids really do appreciate structure. So that just, when you said that made me think of that.
Hey guys, guess what? We have a new website where you can see all of our podcasts and get easy access to the show notes, everything we talk about on the episodes, and you can even listen to the podcast directly from the site. You can contact us through the site and share your thoughts and questions. Check it out at www.everythingalways.co. That's www.everythingalways.co.
And you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Everything Always Co. We just set it up and we'll be sure to put important announcements there.
And we love that this podcast has been so helpful to so many, and our hope is to share it with even more. So can you help us? Will you take a moment now or after the episode to subscribe to the podcast, write a review, and share it? It would mean the world to us, and it helps us to keep bringing you the best content.
Come on, we appreciate you guys. So what do you say, baby? Back to the episode?
Back to the episode.
Okay, our next question. This is one that I've gotten a couple of times, and I think it's important. So not a ton, but I have gotten it at least more than once, and I've seen it myself. So the question is, my husband doesn't support my children's extracurricular activities, and they fall on the times that the children are with him. What is the best way to handle this?
Yeah, this can be a really sticky issue for lots of co-parents. So if you're not already doing it, I would suggest consulting with dad before signing kids up for any extracurricular activities. So that's the first thing, because a lot of times we don't communicate. Kids say they want to play soccer, we sign them up for soccer, and we just expect that the other parent is going to pony up. Right. So I think that you need to make sure that you're, keeping the other parent in the information loop and talking about these things ahead of time and what the, time commitment's going to be. That can make a big difference. Now, if dad's still not willing to be supportive, then, I make a concerted effort to figure out what's dad's issue regarding the activity. So a lot of times we may assume that they're just digging in their heels and being difficult, but there could be something else. Could be a timing issue, could be, already feels like he doesn't get enough time with the kids. So how can you work around that? Is there a way for you to be flexible to kind of meet dad halfway? Is it a work schedule? I mean, who knows? Kind of, you want to kind of peel back the layers.
Right.
So first starting up with keeping them in the loop, then you want to find out kind of what the underlying issue is, why it's a problem. And if dad still isn't willing to work on involving the kids in activities, then do what you can to manage it on your own. So, sign kids up for things you can cover.
Right.
And approach it that way. If you've made every attempt to do all of those things. And I have had these situations, high conflict, where, one parent, sometimes it's mom, sometimes it's dad, they just absolutely refuse. You're not taking away my time. Kids aren't going to be involved in any activities. If it gets to that place, I'd suggest giving mediation a shot, or in a worst case scenario, and this is an absolute last resort, taking the matter back to court. Most family courts will support children participating in reasonable extracurricular activities.
Right.
As long as you're not using them to kind of interfere with the other parent's time, because I've seen it both ways. I've seen a parent who digs in and says, not happening. And I've seen other parents that just completely overschedule kids as a way to minimize the amount of time that children are spending with the other parent.
That is true. And I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah.
So
there are a lot of components to this in different situations that could be happening. One thing that I love that you continuously say, and I love it so much, and even work that I have done with you that has helped so much, is really validating the feelings of the children. Because in the situation where it's something that's just like, well, I just don't think you should be doing it, or whatever that situation is, sometimes it's, I just don't support it, or I don't think they're, I don't think she's even that great at soccer, or whatever the thing is that it does cause, it can invoke feelings of hurt for the child. Why don't you want to let me do something that I love? And I love that you say in all of these situations, really is validating, gosh, I can imagine that must be hurtful, or I can imagine how that feels, or what do you think? Or, just letting them know that their feelings are valid and that they can talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And on this whole thing of activities, I think sometimes you can also put the ball back in the other parent's court. Like, if you're not, supportive of this activity, what kind of activities would you suggest? Is
Right.
there something you'd like to sign the kids up for?
Yes, definitely.
And so, kind of, because a lot of times these fundamentally, we really don't focus from a place of assuming positive intent. And what that means is that assuming positive intent means that you, in good faith, really believe that, people are doing the very best they can given the circumstances.
Yes.
And when we go through the process of splitting up and uncoupling, we're not looking at each other through that kind of lens. We've got hurt and resentment, and we become very skeptical and we become very distrustful. We think there's motives behind everything, and we don't make the assumption of positive intent anymore about one another. And I think that that's really important to pay attention to, and not to jump into assuming what's going on for the other parent.
Yes. And I love that. I think so much conflict could be dramatically reduced if we didn't make those assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's hard. It is really, really hard.
It is.
And sometimes you might be 100% on the money.
You might be
about, a parent's intention, but does it serve your children for you to really stay wedded to that versus, looking for a way to manage it with integrity and staying focused on the kids?
Yes.
And sometimes that means taking a deep breath, biting your tongue, not going there. And
10 deep breaths.
Really hard. Yeah.
Gosh.
That's super tough.
When I've seen newly divorced couples or they're going through stuff and that they're so fast to want to just, react to something. And I'm just like, hey, take a deep breath, give some time, because you don't want to, when you're in that heated moment, that is the worst time.
Absolutely.
You are just opening up the box for more and more. And it's amazing how different, when you've calmed down, how different your response will be, because you're actually responding instead of just reacting.
Right.
And it's incredible. Just some time and deep breaths.
Well, yeah. And it's hard to do because actually that's really not the way our brains are wired.
Right.
Our brains are wired to see those kind of changes in those situations as threats. And so we move into that hypervigilant, fight, flight, freeze kind of reaction. And our executive functioning just shuts down. So all that, reasonable, rational problem-solving skills that we have, they just disappear. And the other piece is that we don't have an endless amount of willpower. And the more your stress level goes up, the quicker your willpower evaporates. It just disappears.
Yes.
And so it sounds so easy from the outside looking in to say, well, you should just do this, just don't go there. Well, it's so much harder to do because everything in our body is telling us, oh, I need to react, and I need to, react very intentionally and be quick about it. Cause that's our brain isn't just, it's not there with us. So yeah, whenever we can realize that in advance and kind of plan a strategy, give yourself reminders, even if you have to put sticky notes everywhere, breathe.
Yes. And it's a practice. It's just a practice that you keep doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. I feel like my ex-wife is changing the kids' schedule all of the time and at the last minute. My wife gets very upset about this as it interferes with our time together and plans we have made. Is it possible to get my ex more organized? This was really funny to me. And I'm like, it was just not funny. I mean, believe me, I empathize and I can totally understand, especially if you are, oh, this is our date night or something. And then it's like all of a sudden I can't have the kids, or whatever. I can, I need you to pick them up, or I can totally get it. But I feel for you. I get it.
Right. It's not the first time I've heard this kind of question.
Right.
And I always tell parents, look at it this way. How much control did you have over your ex when you were together as a couple? Right.
Right.
Probably
exactly.
Zero. Right.
Exactly.
And now you have even less. So, of course, it's totally understandable why that would be frustrating, especially if it's happening on the regular.
Yes.
So if a pattern's developed, you may need to kind of create a strategy to get ahead of the next disruption before it happens. I always recommend start with talking to your ex about needing advance notice before changes as much as possible. I would suggest, even trying something like a co-parenting app to streamline communication and make that easier so that we have so much available to us in terms of technology than ever before. We can text, we can voicemail, we can use good old fashioned email. There's co-parenting apps. So there's lots of ways, but we need to probably, I would say, identify what's the channel of communication so it also doesn't get missed. So even if mom is sending it out ahead of time, are you getting it at the time that she's sending it? So think about how you can streamline that communication. And sometimes you might have to set a limit.
Mm-hmm.
You may have to say, if you don't get enough notice, you may not be able to make the change. Now, you need to balance that with how does this impact the kids? So it may be a case-by-case kind of judgment that you need to make on the fly, because when it's an urgent matter or it's something that really impacts the kids, you might need to be more flexible and you may have to change. And that's kind of just part of parenting. And you can also, if you have something really important, let's say you got tickets to a show, maybe you come up with a backup plan just in case.
Yes.
Like you have a friend on the ready who, if mom calls the last minute and says, hey, you got to come get the kids. Okay, great. Drop them off at Betty's house.
Right.
You've got a sitter lined up. You've got a grandparent, something. It is one of those really, really hard circumstances, but the chances of making mom more organized is probably slim and none.
Yes, exactly. And that's, that's kind of something that we talk about a lot too, is that you can't, like you said, you can't control, you can only control what's happening on your side, really, in terms of scheduling and how things are handled. But the more boundaries that you can put in place, I do believe that you can, the boundaries that you set for yourself start to really set up realistic expectations, not right away, but the more that you stick to those boundaries, you set up those expectations, and it's like, okay, this isn't going to fly. And that person will start to say, okay, it looks like I'm not going to be able to switch things last minute anymore because it hasn't worked the last 3 times,
Right. And I encourage parents not to deal in absolutes, because the worst thing you want to do is you want to set a limit and then you have to backtrack on it.
Right. That's
so
true.
You may want to say, in this particular circumstance, this isn't going to work, sorry, but this is all I can do. Here's the limit. And to deliver it not as an ultimatum, but, as in a very calm and direct way. Because a lot of times when we feel tested or we don't feel respected, we feel like we need to push back with force in order to really assert our limit. And that's not necessarily true. And again, that can really quickly, things can become undone when we get into that pattern. But just do what you can to very calmly say, wow, that's got to be a tough situation for you to be in. I'd love to help you out, but in this particular circumstance, we've already got plans. What other options are there?
Right. Okay. Next question. I'm hoping this one doesn't happen too often, but I did feel like it was important to bring up. My ex is very rude to me in front of our kids. I don't want to look like a pushover, but I often keep my mouth shut and keep the cool. I'm worried my daughter will think it's okay to be spoken to with disrespect. What should I do?
Oh, yeah, that's a really important question and such a challenging situation. And I'm going to go back to what I said before, that, silence isn't always golden.
Yeah.
So a lot of times we think in order to take the higher road, we've just got to keep our mouth shut. And again, that doesn't necessarily serve kids well because they can't make sense of what they're seeing, right? So when a parent's rude, the first thing that I would suggest is minimizing face-to-face communication as much as possible. Just,
Yes.
Close down on those opportunities for that to happen. A lot of times parents, if a child is school age, they can use school as a way to transition between homes. So parents don't necessarily need to have that kind of contact because that's where a lot of it starts,
Totally.
right at the door when we're handing off. I would also say process it with your kids. If dad is rude after dad leaves, pick an appropriate time to circle back to your kids and let them know that you think dad's behavior is not okay and why. And again, be sure to focus on the problem, not the person. You criticizing dad isn't going to be helpful either. So you
Right.
don't want to give what you get. But you can explain to your kids that it seems like dad's really angry. And that happens sometimes when parents go through the process of divorce. You don't agree with how he's handling it. Even when you're angry, it doesn't give you the right to treat people disrespectfully. And that's a value that you believe. So when dad starts being rude, you may need to set some limits with him and say in front of the children, I'm not going to tolerate comments like this. You seem angry. That's fine. However, talking to me in a demeaning or rude way is not.
I love that. And I think that's so great. And I'm so glad that I'm not glad for this person, but I'm glad that this question came up because I think that is a hard thing, especially for the parents that are trying to keep the peace, keep the calm and not say anything negative. But it is a struggle when sometimes you say, but that behavior or that, that I do believe is very wrong and you don't want your kids to adopt that type of behavior. So I love the way that you phrase it in such a very mature, but like really honoring what your values are and letting them see what those values are. So,
right. And think about it in the context of sometimes, again, we need to kind of shift the context of what we're talking about and don't think of dad as dad, but any other rude person that, if you were dealing with somebody at work who was being rude or demeaning, how would you handle that in a professional manner?
Right.
Would you get down on their level or would you be direct? And that's hard because, most people don't like conflict, right?
Right.
So you might need to think ahead and kind of, again, come up with a strategy before you open the door about how you're going to handle it, what you're going to say, role play it a little with somebody you trust. And the other piece of that is, when a parent is bad mouthing, trash talking, rude, they are really not damaging your relationship with kids. They're risking their own because kids will resent that over time. Kids don't like hearing bad things about people they love. And so I think that it's important for parents to realize that the person that's engaging in that kind of behavior is really shooting themselves in the foot.
Yes. And it's, I think it's hard for people to see that, but if you can put yourself in that position of somebody that you really love and somebody saying something negative about them, just think about it and how it would make you feel. Sometimes that happens, I think, just with, friends talking about another friend, somebody's gossiping about someone and you're kind of like, well, I really like that person. I don't want to participate in this,
Right.
It makes you feel bad. And even especially when it comes to children and you're talking about their parents who they look up to and love and admire, who've taken care of them, it starts to, which I think is really interesting. And I remember reading this, very early in my divorce, is how it makes them feel bad about themselves because they're, now they're starting to go, but that's, so my mom or dad is a bad person and I came from them, or it's very confusing and it's just damaging all around. But what I love in terms of this situation is looking at it as the problem, not the person.
Right.
Because I think even with, a married couple with their children, there are times when, mom lost her temper. You know what? I don't agree with how, she handled that. And then mom can even apologize with dad. You know what I mean? There's times where it's just taking responsibility and acknowledging certain behaviors that, are inappropriate.
Right. And I think it's so important, and parents don't often think about this, that kids literally view themselves as half mom, half dad.
Right, right.
My kids were little, they would say, oh yeah, that's the 50% of me that's like mom. And that's the part of me that's like dad. And when we're, a family in one home, kids get lots of validation about the way they're like parents, right?
Yes.
We point out these, oh, you got your dad's beautiful blue eyes and you're so smart like your mom, and we come up with all these comparisons. But then, when the split happens, often those comparisons take a turn for the worst. We either hear
Yes.
bad mouthing or we hear negative comparisons where kids hear, you're so selfish. You're just like your father. He was always thinking about himself. Or, Brittany, where did you get that trashy outfit? That looks just like something your mom would wear.
Oh,
And that's so, oh, yes, exactly. It's so damaging to kids' self-esteem. And you would be amazed at just how it just kind of rolls off
yeah.
the parents' tongue, and they don't realize the impact. Those words are so incredibly powerful. So, I think that we just need to kind of keep in check those, negative comparisons, the way we talk about the other parent. How can we speak in a supportive way? Certainly don't be disingenuous. Like, don't say things you don't mean about the other parent just to say something positive, but you can reaffirm your children's view of their parent. Like,
Yes.
if your child is really excited that they, got to do something special with the other parent, you can say, wow, sounds like that was a really great time for you. You really enjoyed spending time with mom. Or,
Yes.
wow, you're really proud of your dad. It's so great having him as your coach. So you can reinforce their perception and still be very authentic.
Yes. Yes. I love that. One final question. My daughter's mom and I were never married, and we split when my daughter was a baby. I think she and I co-parent really well together, are in fact really good friends. She is remarried, and I have a serious girlfriend. My girlfriend is jealous of the friendship we have and says she and I should have more boundaries. I don't want to let go of the friendship I have and think it's good for my daughter. I also plan to marry my girlfriend and want her to be happy too. What is the right thing to do?
Mm.
And I've seen people struggle with this too. Like, my wife is such, she's a little too good friends with her ex-husband, or, I've seen similar situations. And I thought, well, when I got your answer will apply to many of those questions that we get.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is one of those kind of early stage issues that comes up for,
Yes.
Lots of families in different ways. And I would say go to couples counseling before you say I do. And I would
Yes.
recommend that to every person before, walking down the aisle again, before getting into a second relationship, because second marriages are at greater risk for ending in divorce.
Yes.
They come with lots of baggage.
Yeah.
I don't want to be negative about it, but the truth is it's not the same as a first marriage.
Exactly.
There are a lot of issues and a lot of delicate situations to deal with. So I think it's really important for this person and his girlfriend to really get clear about what the expectations are moving forward. Not just about that relationship, but about lots of things, like how you can handle holidays and finances and schedules and schedule changes and relationships with exes, joint events, because it's a really difficult thing in a relationship for a person to be put in a situation where they have to, it's either me or them,
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to have to try to kind of, just really rethink all that and talk about it. It's a tough conversation to have, but you may want to find out exactly why your girlfriend's having problems with this relationship and what would help her feel more secure. Not to say she's wrong, but something's getting set off. And so you may really need to take a look at that and what balance feels like for the two of you.
Yes.
So, yes, you need to make your relationship with your girlfriend a priority, but you shouldn't feel like you have to compromise your daughter's best interest and your relationship with your co-parent.
Totally agree. And I'll chime in on this question too. With Mike and I did do an episode on this, and it was boundaries with the with the exes. And part of what we talked about was really understanding from each other what each person needs, what makes you happy. Like you said, counseling is amazing, going through that, because there might be something else that's causing that insecurity, and it might not be directly related to that. And once you really, understand each other and what you each need from the relationship, and you make that a priority and know that each other are the priority, things start to shift. And those things that maybe would have bothered you might not bother you so much, and you see it a little bit differently. And that's just, of course, me making an assumption. I'm just saying I've seen that type of thing happen when you really know and have that security in each other that you're the priority. Then the fact that they are friendly is okay. But at the same time, there might be something going on when you're like, that is a little too friendly, or there might be like, how come, when we're on a date, you will answer everything that he or she says, or you're constantly looking at your phone, waiting for a text from them, that happens. So it's really going, okay, well, what is going on here? So it's just an opportunity. And counseling is always such a great opportunity to really bring those things up. And you want to do that definitely before marriage.
Yeah. And even if you can't, for whatever reason, because sometimes counseling's just not doable, for people for a variety of reasons, then have the conversation, and realize that it's also very difficult to be a bonus parent. To come into a relationship that's already established, into a relationship where people have a history, and kids have a history, and being able to embrace that and to know that, there are going to be times when decisions are going to be made that you have absolutely no say in whatsoever that are very much going to impact your life.
Yes.
That's a tough place to be in, and so I think that the pitfall to avoid is have the conversation. Like, it's tough, but you need to start talking about these things and trying to understand each other's perspective and how you're going to move forward. Because if those feelings are there now, you don't talk about them, chances are they're just going to become more of an issue down the road.
Absolutely. Wow. We covered so many great things. all of the burning questions, the top questions that we get. And I'm so grateful for your time today. I'd love to tell our listeners where they can find out more information about you, and if there's a way to speak with you if they need to.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So my website is divorceandandchildren.com. And so if people are looking for more information, I've got articles and different resource suggestions on the website. If somebody's in a situation where they'd like to do some coaching or to work with me directly, they can contact me. And I do work with lots of parents. My practice is a phone practice. So really, I work with parents all over the world. And, you can tap into some support if you feel like you need it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will have a link to your website in our show notes as well. This has been amazing. So good. And I know that I could probably, there's probably 20 million questions. I'm so grateful that I met you and know you, and you've helped me greatly in certain situations. And I'm just so thankful. And I'm so thankful I got to share you with our audience today.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Our goal is to bring you all kinds of value that will help you navigate these challenging waters of blending a family.
Reach out to us if there's something specific you want to hear.
And don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast.
And if you really like it, share it with someone you love.
Ooh, and be bold enough to share it with someone you don't.